Mr. President, today I want to talk about the tragedy of human trafficking. And I want to talk about it today because this is an issue that I hope the entire United States Senate will take up within the next week. We have legislation we've worked on a bipartisan basis over the last couple of years, and we have an opportunity late this week or early next week to address this growing problem. I've spent a lot of time focused on this issue over the last couple of years because of the growth of trafficking and my sense that we can do something constructive here about it. And others have been involved as well. Today I'll be at the White House for a meeting that Ivanka Trump is hosting with congressional colleagues, anti-trafficking advocates, and others who have demonstrated a commitment to addressing this issue. We'll talk about the need to pass this legislation, get it to the President to his desk for signature, and begin to help women and children across our country who are currently being exploited online. We'll probably talk about lots of different kinds of trafficking this afternoon, including work trafficking, other human trafficking, but the one I want to focus on this afternoon is sex trafficking. And the reason is that we have a legislative solution, we think, for addressing the biggest problem. Unbelievably, in this country right now, sex trafficking is actually increasing. Now, that's based on all the best data we're getting from the experts around the country, and they say that it's increasing primarily for one simple reason, and that is the internet. The great increase is happening online. As some have said, this is because of the ruthless efficiency of selling people online. As victims tell me when I'm back home in Ohio, Rob, this has moved from the street corner to the smartphone. And there is a ruthless efficiency about it. Anti-trafficking organizations such as the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, Shared Hope International, and others have told us that the majority of this online sex trafficking they encounter occurs through one single website, and that's called Backpage.com. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children say that Backpage is involved with about 75% of the online trafficking reports it receives from the public. Shared Hope International says it's more than that. I chair a group called the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. And learning about what was going on online, we decided to do an in-depth investigation to find out what was really happening and how we could address it. We spent 18 months studying this, and quickly, online trafficking studying led us to Backpage.com, because again, that's where the majority of this commercial sex trafficking is occurring. And what we found was really shocking. Not only was Backpage, as other websites have in the past, selling women and children online, but this organization and others are actually complicit in these crimes. In other words, they knew much more than we had previously thought. We found that Backpage was actually knowingly selling people online. We did this through a subpoena process that had to be approved here in the United States Senate because the company objected to responding to our subpoenas. We had to come to the entire United States Senate for the first time in 21 years to get approval to actually enforce the subpoenas. We then had to take it all the way to the Supreme Court because they appealed all the way up, and we won. And through this, we were able to get about 1 million documents. We went through these documents to find out what was happening. And what we learned was that this website actually was actively and knowingly involved in selling people online. When a user would post an ad that might have a word that indicated that the girl that they were selling was underage, for instance, it might say cheerleader, or it might simply reference the age of the girl, being 16, 17 years old, younger sometimes. Backpage, instead of rejecting that ad, knowing that it was, of course, illegal, would instead clean up the ad. In other words, editing out the words that indicated someone was underage. They didn't just remove the post because they didn't want to lose the revenue. And you can imagine, this is a very lucrative business. They just insisted that the ad be edited. By the way, this also covered up the evidence of the crime, so this was harder for law enforcement then to find out who was involved in this selling of women, girls online, and underage girls. Of course, it also increased the company's profits. That's what we found out in our report. We also found out that for years and years, people who had been trying to hold these websites accountable in court had failed. And they had failed and been unsuccessful because of a federal law that in essence said to these websites, you have an immunity to be able to do this. You couldn't do it on the street corner, but online you have an immunity to be able to do it. Now, I recommend a powerful documentary. It's called I Am Jane Doe. You can find it on IamJaneDoe.com. It's on Netflix. And it tells the story of underage girls who have been exploited on Backpage. It also talks about the trauma that they experienced. And then finally, it also talks about their frustration with their inability to hold these websites accountable. And again, what might surprise you is that the reason these websites are not accountable, the more we dug into it, the more it became clear it was because of Washington, basically, passing a federal law that I believe has been misinterpreted by the courts, but has been interpreted by the courts to say that these websites have no risk, that they're not liable, they have an immunity under federal law. It's called the Communications Decency Act. And the Communications Decency Act was enacted back in 1996 when the internet was in its infancy. It was intended to protect websites from liability based on third-party posts on that website. So, I understand the intention of Congress, but it now protects websites when they knowingly allow this criminal activity, the crime of sex trafficking, to occur through their site. Again, I believe Congress meant well when enacting this law. In fact, part of its original intent was actually to protect children from indecent material on the internet by holding individuals liable for sending explicit material to those children. Now that same law is being used as a shield by websites that promote and engage in online sex trafficking with immunity. I don't believe Congress ever intended for this broad liability protection for websites that actively and knowingly facilitate online sex trafficking, but the legal interpretation of the law has led to this. That's why America's district attorneys, 50 state attorneys general, judges all over the country, and so many others have called on Congress to amend this communications decency law, amend it, and fix this injustice, really this loophole. Last year, a Sacramento judge threw out pimping charges against Backpage and directly called on Congress to act. Here is what this judge said, and again, this sort of message has been repeated by other courts. The judge said, and I quote, "If and until Congress sees fit to amend the immunity law, the broad reach of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act even applies to those alleged to support the exploitation of others by human trafficking." End quote. That's not just a suggestion, it's an invitation to this Congress to act, calling on us to do what we were sent to do here, which is to craft laws that promote justice. For too long, victims of online sex trafficking have been denied the justice they deserve. And now we have the opportunity here in the United States Senate, I hope within the next week, to be able to fix that. Last August, I introduced legislation called the Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act, or SESTA, with a bipartisan group of 24 co-sponsors, including my co-author, Senator Richard Blumenthal, and Senators John McCain, Claire McCaskill, John Cornyn, Heidi Heitkamp, and others. SESTA would provide justice for victims of online sex trafficking and hold accountable those websites that intentionally facilitate these crimes. We do this by making two very narrowly crafted changes to federal law. First, we remove the Communications Decency Act's broad liability protections for a narrow set of bad actors that knowingly facilitate sex trafficking crimes. High standard, knowingly. Second, the legislation allows state attorneys general to prosecute websites that violate federal trafficking laws, existing federal trafficking laws. SESTA simply says that if you're violating federal sex trafficking laws and you're knowingly facilitating it, then you have to be held to account. That seems to make all the sense in the world, and it'll make a big difference for these girls and these women who are being exploited online. Our bill protects websites that are doing the right thing, by the way. In fact, it preserves what's called the Good Samaritan provision of the Communications Decency Act, which protects good actors who proactively block and screen their sites for offensive material. Thus, it shields them from frivolous lawsuits, and I think that's appropriate. We simply carve out a very limited exception in the Communications Decency Act's liability protections for those that knowingly facilitate sex trafficking. And by the way, there are already exceptions for things in this law, exceptions for things like copyright infringement. So this isn't a new idea. So unless you think protecting copyrights is more important than protecting women and children from the trauma of trafficking, you should be for this. Even those who support Section 230 otherwise should strongly support this. If a prosecutor can prove in court that a website has committed these acts, SESTA allows that website to be held liable and the victims to get the justice that they deserve. By the way, 68 senators now, more than two-thirds of this body, have signed on as co-sponsors of this legislation, a majority of Republicans and a majority of Democrats. That doesn't happen very often around here. The House of Representatives passed SESTA as an amendment to a broader anti-sex trafficking bill just a couple of weeks ago by an overwhelming margin, more than 300 votes. The Trump administration has endorsed this solution and again shown a commitment to the issue. So SESTA has overwhelming support from the White House, from more than 300 House members, and from the 68 senators who signed on to be part of this solution. I think one reason it's gotten so much support is because of the logic of the legislation, the fact that we narrowly drew up the legislation not to affect internet freedom, to be sure we were listening to people who had concerns, but also, and more importantly, because we're all hearing about this issue back home. We're all hearing the stories, and they are powerful, and they are compelling, and they're heartbreaking. So Kubicki Pride comes to Congress, to our subcommittee, as we were looking into this issue, and tells us her story. In testimony, she says, my daughter ran away from home. She'd gone missing. She'd been missing for several weeks. Obviously, I was very concerned. I couldn't find her. Someone suggested to look on this website called Backpage. So I did. And she said, I found my daughter. I found my daughter, 14 years old, but found her daughter in very sexually difficult photographs, horrible photographs of her beautiful daughter. So she calls Backpage.com and says, you know, I'm Kubicki Pride, that's my daughter on your website. She's 14 years old. I'm so glad I found her. Thank you for taking down that ad. She's 14 years old. You know what the person on the other end of the phone said? Did you post the ad? This is how evil these people are. She said, well, no, I didn't post the ad. This is my daughter. Been trying to find her. She's been missing for several weeks. You didn't post the ad. You didn't pay for it. You can't take it down. And we won't take it down. That's what we're dealing with here. Eventually, she found her daughter, got her daughter back, went through the proper process to be able to hold Backpage accountable. And guess what? The court said, sorry, under Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, Congress wrote this bill. This website has an immunity, even though she's 14 years old and she was being sold online. So I think that's why 68 senators have said, let's step up and do this. This is something we can do around here that's not partisan, that isn't about politics. It's about people. It's about human dignity. It's about ensuring that more girls like Kubicki Pride's daughter don't have to go through this trauma, that more women and children can live out their life's purpose without having to go through this trauma. I think that's why we've been able to find so many members who want to step up and do something here, and to do something that will really make a difference. So let's vote on this legislation in the next week. Let's get it signed into law so that more children, more women are not exploited through this brutally efficient process online of selling people. If we do this, Mr. President, we're going to be able to provide justice to those victims who deserve it. And we're going to be able to make this world a little better place. I urge the Senate to vote in this next week. And for those members who are not yet part of this legislation, we urge you to join us. Wouldn't it be great to have everybody on board to correct this injustice, to close this loophole, and to ensure that everyone has the ability to meet their God-given purpose in life? I yield back.